Here we go. One step at a time, don't be living on the line. I don't need a friend.
Before I get started, I just want to ask, does this giant screen make my head look big? This is the single most disorienting way to present I have ever engaged in. So you'll have to forgive me if, halfway through I just become fixated on. All right, everybody's awake now, right? All right. And thank you very much for turning the heat up in this room a little bit. I'd like to promise to bring it up a couple more notches, but seriously, my topic's information governance. I mean, really. Don't expect too much. All right, a little bit about me. I have been in the content management space since Thornton May started as AIIM president, which was a long time ago. Back then, imaging was the hot buzzword. That just goes to further date me. I transitioned from content management to records management when it became clear that as a technologist, when I talked to people who had any sort of a compliance or regulatory role in the organization, they viewed me as a wildcat that needed to be tamed. In order to be able to address their very real and very valid concerns about security of information and trustworthiness and whether or not a given piece of electronic information would be accepted in court, I schooled myself a little bit on records management, and that's where in recent 3 years I have focused my time. Another thing that I wanted to say about Land O'Lakes. As you go through my presentation, I need to caveat all of it with, Land O'Lakes gave me a huge advantage in implementing an information governance program. And the advantage they gave me was, prior to me starting with the organization 3 years ago, they had not had a records manager or a records management program for the previous 10 years. So I didn't have any rebranding to do. I got to start from the ground up. So I'm not going to take a bunch of undue credit when really I had a wonderful circumstance that I was able to step into, and I was savvy enough, I'll give myself that much credit, on about week 2 of being the records manager to decide, I don't want to manage records. I want to govern information. That's what this organization really needs. I probably should have practiced with this before I started. I did it! All right. Yeah. Oh, by the way, I follow instructions poorly, so I brought handouts. They're on the table with the lady in the suit and the reddish, there we go, a little higher, there we go. There's handouts there if you want them when you leave. That way you have at least my contact information, and you'll have all of the bullets that I'm not going to have time to go through, like these. Back in the day, records management was considered an administrative role. Very highly skilled clerical people got promoted to be records managers. As a result, as a discipline, it was easily ignored, it was consistently under-resourced, and it had no authority. And all you records managers in the room are going, yeah, as opposed to today when it's easily ignored, under-resourced, and has no authority. However, when the federal rules of civil procedure changed, and it made it clear that every piece of information your organization has in its possession must be producible in response to a subpoena, that administrative role shifted, and it became much more of a compliance role, and it actually got some backbone to it and some teeth in it. And at the same time, we had this explosion of technology where things went to cloud, things went social. There were just so many more types and locations for data than ever before. If you've heard the chessboard analogy, you're tired of it, but I've become a recent Malcolm Gladwell fan, and reading his book, The Tipping Point, one of his introductory questions is, if you take a piece of paper and you fold it in half 50 times, how high is that stack of paper? The answer is that stack of paper would reach from here to the sun. Completely counterintuitive. But we are at the point in our technology and our information growth, where we're doing the 23rd, 26th, 30th fold of that piece of paper. The first ones weren't incrementally that substantial. Now, every time information doubles, it's just that much bigger of an impact. Information governance is only a subset of your overall corporate governance program. And so you have to look at your corporate governance culture in order to make sure an information governance, to fit your information governance program within it. It tries to do three things. And if I'd been savvy, I would have reversed the order of these bullets. Because my primary goal is always, I want to maximize the business benefit that we get out of this information. I want to do it in such a way that we manage risks and cost. But the primary driver is, I want to make sure the right information gets to the right people at the right time and allows them to be smarter and faster at their jobs. The other thing about information governance is it is not rigid. It cannot be. It has to be flexible enough to provide you some controls without, and not limit how fast your corporation can respond. Therefore, it's strategic, and it includes this life cycle management. So disposable disposition is within the context of information governance, not separate from it. Back to my point about starting with the business, whenever I look at a governance program or an organization's information as a whole, and I got 20 years of consulting behind me, so I've done this many times, the first thing I start with is, what is the work you're trying to get done as an organization? Another interesting thing about Land O'Lakes that some people may not realize is we're actually three huge different divisions. We are the dairy division, the butter with the Indian maiden on it, with which everyone is familiar. We are also Purina Feeds, so we make more animal feed than anybody in the world. We are also Winfield Agriculture Products, so we make more crop protection and crop nutrient products than anybody in the world, or we sell more. I can't remember what the statistic is. So we have very different lines of business, and they all have different annual cycles of peaks of sales. They all have different philosophies. We formed them, all except for the dairy division, by buying previous existing companies, and we had to absorb their information and their culture. So what I try to do with information governance is first pay attention to what are we actually trying to get done here as an organization, and then I make sure to give the information the rules and the tools, because a rule without a tool, the first thing somebody's going to do is figure out how to circumvent the rule in order to get their job done, to do their jobs. My big point on this one, I went to the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota, and they taught us, you know, total quality management, the Deming approach, and how if you get enough really smart people in the room and get them to look at a process, they're going to come up with the perfect way to do it. So I've got lots of team building experience and training in my background. What no one told me was, when you put an information governance team together, it's not a real, it's a different kind of team. It's a team, it's a multidisciplinary team. It is not one group of people who are all trying to figure out how to push a pencil across the table the quickest possible. I should have come up with a better analogy, something that somebody would actually do. Anyway, instead, you're getting a whole bunch of people into a room that their primary drivers are completely different and their skill sets are completely different. So all my basic team training was wasted because they don't have they don't have a unified background or mindset or philosophy, and they're not all headed in the same direction. So managing and directing a multidisciplinary team is something that's worth looking into. Maybe just do a little Google searching on that if you're going to undertake a governance program. Because you're going to have people in the room that are not, they don't naturally coexist in the same environment. Largely, oh, no, there is a good point to be made here. In that, as an information governance professional, you have to know or know who in the organization knows a lot more than just how to apply an appropriate retention schedule. You got to know what your organization might have in terms of personally identifiable information, or what your organization considers critical trade secrets. How to make butter apparently is not a big trade secret, but we have things like the recipe for the powder that goes on Doritos. That's a pretty big trade secret. At the same time, we've got a perfect storm of regulation. None of this is new, but when I started listing it and putting it all together and realizing the overlap between these, it became clear that they've driven us to critical mass where there's an overall compliance need to look at information more holistically. We are governed by, the same sort of rules that probably govern all of you, except we're not subject to SOX because we're not publicly held. We are we're the second largest co-op in the world, but we do have the Food Safety Act that we have to comply with. And that one was my favorite example of needing incredibly good documentation. The Food Safety Act requires that for every carton of eggs we sell, that we have the documentation to show be able to tell you identify every carton of eggs that was delivered to that grocery store along with that carton. Okay, you got a bad carton, you got to trace it. Every carton of eggs that was on the pallet that carton of eggs was on, every carton of eggs that was on the truck that pallet of eggs was on, every carton of eggs that was in the cooler that carton of eggs was stored in, and where the egg that went into the carton of eggs originated from. So we have to be able to trace, for a given food item, anything that might have been cross-contaminated with it that many layers back, all the way back to the chicken. That's a lot of documentation. And I thought police reports were bad when I did my first consulting gig. Everybody's familiar with the business drivers. We got too much going on, too many resources, nobody has a ton of extra money, nobody has a lot of geniuses sitting around going, I'm bored and don't have anything to do. So, practical. How do you get going? Yeah, start thinking and talking about it. When somebody says, what is it? Oh, I forgot to bring the definition. I just read, there's a governance council report out that just did a great study on how well organizations are doing on governing their information. And it had the best definition of information governance I've read yet in it. And I forgot to bring it. Sorry. So, step one. Draft a policy. Go look up that definition of information governance that I just gave you hints to, and draft a policy that says, as an organization, information is one of our most valuable assets, and we will govern it, and here's how. Make sure that it's something that is actually implementable, can be put into practice, and something against which you can measure bad behavior. You want to be able to say, the following activity you did was in violation of our information governance policy. Or, when we deploy this system, we will do it in such a way that it is in compliance with our information governance policy. So that policy has to be detailed enough that it can be a measure against which activity is, something against which activity is measured. Then define scope. What are you going to govern and what are you not going to govern? Because everything is not a valid answer. You have to at least be able to define, this is what we consider Land O'Lakes information, and this is what is not Land O'Lakes information. The fact that I send and receive personal emails in my work email account, my organization had to decide in our policy, is that within the scope of the information we're going to govern, or is that just something that we're going to ignore? Many questions like that had to be answered. And then, of course, you've got to implement some level of accountability for it. Hopefully at as high a level as possible. As far as I'm concerned, the best tool I have in my toolkit is I have a big bucket retention schedule. I like big buckets and I can't deny. All right, so I can't help it. The first 4 items on my retention schedule are 4 big buckets that if anyone was talking to you about records management would say, You don't have any business dealing with those because they're not records. They are convenience copies. This handout that I just gave you is a convenience copy. You are not the record owner for it. You have zero responsibility for that handout. It's a convenience copy. Get rid of it as soon as it is no longer useful to you. We also included reference material. Organizations go out to the universe and get information that helps make people smarter at their jobs. But it's not information they created. It's not information that they own. That's just reference material. We put a bucket out there for that. We also put administrative as a bucket. That's the nuts and bolts of just running a business. Your meeting agendas, the planning documents for last year's company picnic, administrative stuff. And then the last was transitory communications, emails, texts, no, not emails, sorry, instant messages, text messages, voicemails. For us, we're all lumped into transitory communications. They come, they go. That's it. Why? You know why? Because I have the attention span of a gnat, and a couple weeks into being a records manager, I was so tired of the record, non-record conversation, because after you spent 20 minutes figuring that out, then you got to start talking about whether or not to keep it. So I just go right to, do we need to keep it? What's its value? Historic, legal, business? No? Then we don't need to keep it. All right. Does it have protected information in it? Yes. Then we have a disposal method that is dictated. Those are the questions that are important, not is it a record or not. And then there's all those other benefits, most important of which is it allows you to start talking about the benefits instead of trying to frighten people with legal sanctions. Because nobody gets up in the morning highly motivated to avoid trouble. You get up in the morning because you want to make a positive change in the world. That's what information governance gives you. The bottom line, figuring out what to do with a specific record or a specific system has value in that point of time. Information governance has value over the long term. It has relevance over the long term. You're going to have record types popping up so fast you can't whack the moles fast enough. So if you were trying to keep an inventory of every single record type you have, it would be a full-time job in almost any size organization. Instead, taking a strategic, high-level information governance approach allows you to be proactive versus reactive, which is way more interesting. I thought this was fascinating. Symantec did a survey back in 2011, and what I loved was that email was not the most highly sought-after source of information anymore. And that social media and texts are right up there along with SharePoint. So anybody who tells you we don't have to worry about content in SharePoint because it'll never be subpoenaed, just show them the Symantec study and say, that's not the way it works in the real world anymore. It's information, we have it, therefore we have to have a management approach to it. And your answer is information governance. If you grab the handouts, there's a couple great lists of resources for you. And I'm down to almost exactly the right amount of time. I will say this, though. Oops, on the Symantec study. What I liked was the social media and texts would have, most people would say those are not records. But look at the volume of them that are being subpoenaed. You've got to have a management plan for those. So, for instance, what we did is we said, when we rolled out instant messaging to every single desktop in the organization, our retention period for instant messages is going to be 0 minutes. When you close that information, that instant message session, that content is gone. We do not log them. How do we support that from a compliance perspective? We have an instant messaging guideline that we wrote that said, appropriate use of instant messaging is for really, really transitory stuff, like, do you have the stapler? Meet me at the back door for lunch. Where are we going? If you've got a decision or an approval or something like that, you don't do it as an instant message. And so that was our backup for saying, we're not going to keep them. They're not records. They're not, sorry, oops, busted. They're not records that have any long-term value. And now I'm going to open it up to questions.
It's very, very good. Just while you're thinking, spotted the question, while you're thinking of some questions, an unashamed plug. The Industry Watch on Information Governance was published yesterday and can be downloaded from the AIM website and covers some of the issues that Monica described so much more interestingly this afternoon. So we have a question over here.
Thank you. Actually, that was great. Thank you very much. Yeah, and I just have to say I agree with everything that you said. And my question is...
And that's the end of that question.
Yeah. But I have a question. On a number of occasions, I renamed my function from records management to, records manager to records and information manager, et cetera, but always that discussion of what is a record, and I always had a very, very broad view, as you do, of data, information, records, et cetera, and it all needs either governance one way or another. When you're in an organization that also has a CIO and just in terms of the nomenclature and the move to an information governance role, how do you deal with that?
That's a really good point, and everybody heard the question, right? How do you, if I'm governing information, well then what is our CIO doing? And how's our CIO going to be, is he going to be receptive to the fact that I'm saying I govern information? And so what I try to do is say, my job is to come up with the rules. You as CIO, you are responsible for coming up with the tools. And therefore, I will never dictate a rule without working with your people first and ensuring that we have some way to implement that rule. Sometimes, implementation of the rule is just you communicate to people that you're not supposed to use instant messaging for blah. We can't stop them from doing it, but we have a rule. Sometimes we can actually put some technologies behind the rules that allow mandatory enforcement of them. So that's how we did that. And the other advantage I have is that I work in lockstep with the head of information security, who's in charge of all our e-discovery efforts. And she's within IT. So that relationship allows me to make sure that this is a joint, it's a discussion we are having versus I am having. Thank you, good question.
Just a question on those instant messages. If your acceptable use policy says that you must not flame your colleagues on instant messages, do you have no record if you need to actually follow that up from an HR point of view?
Yes, exactly. Our instant message, the guideline, okay, so the question was, what if somebody starts harassing you via instant message and you don't have a record of that? Couple things. We can always start logging a specific person's instant messages. If a coworker complains that someone's harassing them, we can start logging their instant messages in order to do an investigation. That's an exception, and it's absolutely appropriate in response to a situation like that. The other thing we can do is if you don't close the session, we could always go through the process of making sure you grab a screenshot of that or help you capture or save the instant message manually if we need it for evidence. And that's actually the bottom line of the policy. If you have something going on in instant messaging that you need to keep, make a quick call to the help desk, we'll walk you through it.
You're just so sensible. It's just crazy. Another question. We have an expert here who's actually done an information governance policy properly. Anybody got another question? Yeah.
After 10 years of not having a records manager, why did they hire you? What convinced them, or what was the driver?
That's a really good question. Why did they hire a records manager? They hired a records manager and an enterprise content management analyst at exactly the same time. They posted both positions, the IT position and the position in legal. And it was because they had hired Deloitte to come in and do a study, and Deloitte basically said to them, you really need to manage your records. Yeah, and now I don't know what motivated them to hire Deloitte, but I suspect that, they were not, they weren't complete ostriches. They were aware of what was going on in the world and realized that even though we have an incredibly low litigation profile for such a big company, we have so few lawsuits. It's staggeringly surprising. They did realize that we were potentially at risk.
Any other questions? Just supporting your documentation of food, anybody who's been following what's been going on in Europe, they've actually found traces of horse meat in some beef products that they've had to trace all the way back to farms in Ireland and goodness knows what. And it's just such a... No, it's not actually a health hazard, but the thing that's upsetting people is that the provenance of the beef is not what it says on the tin.
Yep.
So beware, these things can rush up on you. Monica, excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.